All right, that brings us to our program today, and that's none other than our own Jack Sididine speaking about guns.
I do this with some trepidation. We have a couple of ground rules that I have to tell you about. First of all, no heckling from Chuck Rodnick. Secondly, you can ask any question you want except a two-part question. I'm the only one allowed to do two-part questions. One part. Some of you know that I spend about 4 months a year in Florida, and I know a lot of you say, what does he do down there? Well, you're going to find out a little bit today. Among other things, I give lectures, and I give them for a group called the Renaissance Academy, which is a group that was put together and sponsored by Florida Gulf State University. It's basically a continuing education program for adults, and a wide variety of programs. You can pick and choose about probably 1,000 different programs. The last couple of years, I've given two programs, one on the electoral system and the second one on guns. And when I put the program together on guns, it occurred to me that this would probably be outdated in a year or two. But unfortunately, it hasn't been, because we continue to have an epidemic. But if you follow the news today, you know that we had 2 shootings in Indiana, one yesterday in Indianapolis and one this morning in one of the suburbs of Indianapolis. So it hits close to home. And if some of your memories are not too dim, you'll remember just a few years ago at our friendly Martin store, Bristol Street, we had a shooting. So it touches all aspects of our lives. Just a couple of other preliminary comments. I am not a gun expert. Some of you know I spent some time in the FBI. I have to say, I never fired a weapon before I went in. I had the highest score they ever had in 5 years. One of the instructors took me aside and he said, why do you think you did so well? You spent a lot of time hunting as a boy. And I said, no, I never fired a weapon in my life. I just did what you told me to do. I haven't fired a gun since, so I'm not an expert. I'm also not pro-gun or anti-gun. I just want to give you the facts as they are, and let you draw your own conclusions. So let's start. 2 weeks ago, almost to the hour, my wife and I were visiting our sons in Winnetka, Illinois, and it was the 4th of July. And we decided to go to the 4th of July parade, as many of you probably did here. So we went to the main street, and we were sitting on the curb, and all of the floats were going by, and it was typical small town America. And I remember thinking, what a great day. You know, we could celebrate our independence. And we had bands, and we had Boy Scouts, and we had baton twirlers. And I was thinking, what a great day to celebrate the 4th. 6 miles down the road in Highland Park, a group of people very similar to us was watching their 4th of July parade. But 7 of them did not go home. And more than 24 went to the hospital because we had another mass shooting. I looked it up, it was about the 350th mass shooting this year. Now, if you do the math, that's about 2 a day. The definition of a mass shooting has kind of varied over the years, but it's generally thought to be either 3 or 4. The conventional definition today is 4 people either killed or wounded. So a lot of mass shootings. And when I give these programs, I'm invariably asked, do you think we have a more violent society than the rest of the world? And I'm sad to say the answer probably is yes. And that's going to surprise you, but the answer lies in our history. So I'm going to give you a very brief history lesson. Now, this program was designed to go an hour and a half. That's the bad news. The good news is I'm going to cut it down to about 15 minutes, so we're going to go through some of these slides really fast. A little history on the U.S. When our country was founded, there was nothing here. There were Native Americans, there were a lot of trees. Now, compare that to Europe, where Europe had been settled and civilized for thousands of years. Compare it to the Far East, the same thing was true there. We were a new continent. So when the English settled the colonies, they had to have guns. It was necessary for protection, it was necessary for hunting. As the revolution started to brew, the English, who were the source of most of our guns, decided we're not going to import guns to the colonies anymore. Those guys are getting kind of riled up. So they quit importing guns. And then things got worse to the point where they said to the colonists, you cannot have guns, they're illegal. And things progressed to the point where they say, we're going to go into your homes and we're going to take your guns. And of course, the colonists remembered this after the Revolutionary War was won, so they decided to codify the right to bear arms in the Constitution. That gave rise to the Second Amendment. It might surprise you to know very little discussion about the adoption of the Second Amendment, and it's a really short worded amendment. Let me just read it to you. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. And I want to draw your attention to the word militia because that was basically the reason that the Second Amendment was put in. I'm not going to go through all of these slides, as I said, but there's only 3 countries that enshrine guns in their Constitution: the United States, Mexico, and Guatemala. The Second Amendment, as I said, was not very controversial. The founding father, James Madison, actually introduced a second version of the Second Amendment. It didn't get adopted, but it's very similar. I want to read that to you. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. A well-armed and well-regulated militia, magic word again, being the best security of a free country, but no person religiously scrupulous of bearing arms shall be compelled to render military service in person. The reason that the militia was important to the colonists is because when the U.S. was formed, we had no standing army. And some of you history buffs will realize that we never had a standing army for about the first 7 or 8 years. It was not until Matt Anthony Wayne did his excursion out west that we really developed a standing army. So it was important for the states to have militias, and that was the basis for the adoption of the Second Amendment. Really didn't have a lot to do with individual right to bear arms. It was more a militia. And you remember Washington had to forge together these 13 militias into an army. If you read the history of that, he did an incredible job because it was a ragtag bunch. But that concept of militia extended after the country was formed. 2 cases I want to tell you about very briefly involving the Second Amendment. There's been very little litigation by the Supreme Court involving the Second Amendment. And the reason I pick these 2 is because often when I give talks in front of school kids, I give them a question and I say, would you tell me what justice is? And I get wonderful responses from the kids, very flowery, legal principles and so forth. And I have to tell you, having spent more than 50 years in the judicial system, that that justice is what someone says it is on a given day. No more and no less. If you recall, it was perfectly just and legal to own another human being. Okay, somebody changed that, thank you. One of the earliest cases, this was 1876, the United States versus Cruikshank. The Supreme Court said this, and I want to contrast this with the next case I'm going to tell you about. They said the right to bear arms is not granted by the Constitution. Neither is it in any manner dependent upon that instrument for its existence. The Second Amendment means no more than it shall not be infringed by Congress and has no other effect than to restrict the powers of the national government. I want you to contrast that with this case. And this case is an interesting case, and I got to give you a little history on it. The District of Columbia versus Heller was decided in 2008. There's a little personal connection that I had with this case. This is what we lawyers call a engineered or a manufactured case. Many times, if you want an issue decided by the Supreme Court, you will pick your fact situation ahead of time. You'll pick the law that you want to have the Supreme Court review. You'll pick the fact situation of how you're going to bring that law before the court, and you'll pick the forum, in other words, where you want to bring the case. The District of Columbia versus Heller was started by a guy by the name of Bob Levy, L-E-V-Y. Bob was the head of the United States Libertarian Association. Anybody here a libertarian? Well, Jeff could probably tell you, the idea that the libertarians have is that the best law is no law. They would have you go to the most minimum laws possible to make a society work. And I suspect if they could get rid of stoplights, they would probably do that. Bob Levy was head of the Libertarians. He decided that they were going to bring a manufactured case before the Supreme Court to test whether the Second Amendment actually applied to individuals. The court had never said that before. Does it really give you as a person the right to bear arms? So they said, we're going to manufacture a case. So they took a guy by the name of Heller, who was a security guard in Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. had a really strict gun law. That basically said, when you keep a gun in your house, you have to have it disassembled and stored in a locked safe. Well, Heller was a security guard. And he said, that's really restrictive. There's no way I can do that. I got to put it together, take it apart every day. That's just not going to work. So they set him up to violate the law. And he did, in fact, violate the law. And the case then went through the various appellate procedure up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court decided it. The interesting aspect of this case, and I'll tell you what the court said in a moment, but the interesting aspect was I got into a discussion in a group that I was in with Bob Levy. And I said, Bob, you're a libertarian. Yeah, I'm a libertarian. And I said, you would say that any judge who goes beyond the Constitution is an activist judge. And he should not be allowed to do that. He should stick strictly to the Constitution. If something is not enumerated in the Constitution, it's unconstitutional. He said, absolutely.
Meeting, and I'm actually remotely on Rotary. No.
I'm getting something here, but I'm not sure what. So I. That's okay.
Can you just...
Excuse me. I said to Bob, so you're saying that if something isn't in the constitutional, you can't decide it. It's not in the Constitution. He said, yes. And I said, would you agree with me that's probably one of the most fundamental rights that we have in our system is the right for the Supreme Court to decide something is unconstitutional. He said, absolutely. I said, would you show me in the Constitution where it gives the right to the Supreme Court to declare a law unconstitutional? There was total silence. It's not in the Constitution. It's not even implied. It was pulled out of thin air by John Marshall, Marbury versus Madison. If you want to say that we had an activist judge, go back to one of the very first ones. He was an activist judge. He gave us that right. The court in the District of Columbia against Heller, and this was an opinion written by Justice Scalia, ruled that the Second Amendment, quote, codified a pre-existing right. Remember the other case I told you about that said the Constitution had nothing to do with the Second Amendment. This now the court says it codified a pre-existing right, and it protects an individual right to possess a firearm unconnected with a service in a militia. First time they said that. And to use that arm for traditionally lawful purposes such as self-defense within the home. But the court also went on to say that the right is not unlimited. It is not a right to keep and carry any weapon whatsoever, in any manner whatsoever, and for whatever purpose. And that's important because it says it's not an unlimited right. The latest court case was just decided a few weeks ago. That was New York Rifle and Pistol Association versus Bruin. It decided that a New York law, which is quite strict, to carry concealed handguns in public was unconstitutional, and you don't have to have a permit to carry a firearm. The state of Indiana has some interesting laws. Indiana is very liberal with respect to firearms. They recently ruled that a person can carry a firearm in Indiana without any permit whatsoever. You might be also interested to know that if you're 18 years of age or older, you can bring a firearm to work. You can also bring it to a school. It has to be in a car, and the car has to be locked. But I suggest not very many school administrators or employers are probably going to go through the parking lot and go through 400 or 500 cars. Just some interesting statistics. I won't give you all of them, but there's approximately 400 million firearms in the United States. We have more firearms than we have people. 40 to 45% of U.S. households own a gun. 17 to 19% of adults own a handgun. Why do they own those weapons? 67% to protect against crime. 66% for target shooting, 41% for hunting. In 2019, U.S. deaths from guns were 4 per 100,000 people. That's 18 times the average of the rest of the world. I'm not going to go through all of these, but some interesting statistics that might surprise you. 42% of Americans will be the victim of a completed violent crime in the course of their lives. That's higher than I would have guessed. 83% of Americans will be the victim of an attempted or completed violent crime. 52% will be the victim of an attempted or completed violent crime more than once. This is an interesting statistic for those of you involved in the legal system, or just general public knowledge. Currently, for every 12 aggravated assaults, robberies, sexual assaults, rapes, and murders committed in the U.S., one person is sentenced to prison for committing the crime. What does that tell you? Crime may pay.
Yeah.
1/3 of U.S. adults believe there would be less crime if more people own guns. And the converse is 2/3 would believe that there would not be less crime. The U.S. has more mass shootings than the rest of the world combined. This is not a current chart. I wasn't able to update it quickly enough, but as I said, we've had 350 this year. That works out to about 2 per day. And you can see the increase is significant. These are the worst mass shootings since 1991. The worst one was in 2017. That was the guy in Las Vegas. To this day, they've never understood why he did what he did, but he killed 58 people from the high-rise hotel. And he used what was called a bump stock. We'll talk a little bit about assault weapons, but assault weapons are weapons that are basically designed to kill people. They're not hunting rifles. And they are what's called semi-automatic, which means each time you have to pull the trigger to fire a round. It's very simple to convert these to automatic weapons. The guy in Las Vegas had a piece of plastic that you put on the stock, the end of the gun, so that when you pull the trigger, the explosion of that bullet chambers up the next bullet and fires that. So all you have to do is hold your trigger on your finger on the trigger, and it just rapidly shoots. You can do the same thing with a large rubber band. You can go online and figure out how to do it in a matter of minutes. Orlando, Florida, with 2016, that was the guy that decided he didn't like gay people, and he killed 49. Virginia Tech, you remember that one? There were 32. Sandy Hook, a tragic case, 27 people killed, and that including mostly young children. U.S. mass school shootings, and these seem to be on the uptick. I don't understand quite why, but there's no particular geographic area that is exempt. And we haven't been able to put on the Highland Park or the Indiana ones, but they were just very recent. But I wanted to show you that they're dispersed throughout the country. This is a slide that is not completely up to date, but I'll give you the up-to-date numbers. This goes back to 2012, when we had about 34,000 homicides by guns. That number today is 45,000. But more than half of the homicides by guns are suicides. They're people that take their own lives. The rest are homicides. And you'll see the number in 2012 was only 71 in mass shootings. That number has grown larger, but even today, mass shooting still accounts for a small fraction of total homicides. To give you an idea, 45,000 homicides by guns in the US last year. Do you know how many Japan had? They have 1. These are homicide gun deaths per 1 million people. And the reason I show this is because it's very ethnic. Now you'll see that the biggest number of homicides by guns in the US is black males. I have nothing against Black Lives Matter. I think it's a fine movement. I have nothing against it. But one of the things that most people didn't realize was that 2 weeks ago, 7 people were killed in Highland Park. 10 people were killed in Chicago with guns. No publicity whatsoever for those 10 people. Why? Because it was black on black. Now, Black Lives Matter certainly seems when the shooter is white and the victim is black. When the shooter is black and the victim is black, black lives don't seem to matter too much. And I think that's a tragedy because it happens literally every day. So the biggest homicides, victims by guns are black males, Latino males next, black females, white males, Latino females, white females are the lowest. Gun deaths have increased in recent years. I won't go into great detail, we know that. Gun murders per 100,000 residents. This is comparing us to the other developed countries. You probably can't see all of the countries there, but I'll just tell you, the graph on the far left is the US. Next is Italy. If you go all the way down, the last two are Japan and Iceland. But look how much we are compared to the rest of the world. The top 10 civilian gun owning countries, this surprised me. The United States, of course, is first, but Yemen is second. Switzerland is third. Switzerland requires gun ownership because they don't have an army, they have militias. So they require you to own a gun. Finland, Cyprus, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Uruguay, Canada, and Austria in that order. We have more guns than we have people. This chart is a little bit out of date, 393 million guns. That number is 400. Every time there's a mass shooting, the number of guns goes up geometrically. People are afraid they're going to take away their guns, so they go out and buy more guns. We have 326 million people. Might surprise you, an interesting statistic I didn't make a graph on. 5% of gun owners own 50% of the guns. What does that tell you? That if you're a gun owner, you probably have multiple guns. And not many of them are sporting guns. And I suspect there are people in the room, Tom Pletcher, might have 10 or 12 guns or sporting guns. There are also gang members that have a lot of guns. We have more gun shops than grocery and fast food stores. So when I first looked at that, I said, that can't be. I don't see gun shops all over. I mean, I see Dick's Sporting Goods and I see Walmart, but I don't see a bunch of gun shops. Well, the definition of a gun shop under federal law is any person who is a licensed gun dealer. He could be a gun shop and run it out of his house, and a lot of them are. So consequently, you do have a lot of gun shops. Compared to supermarkets, it gives you the breakdowns, Subways, McDonald's, Starbucks. There are more retail gun stores, which would include individuals dealing in guns, than we have our franchises. This is one of those interesting charts that it probably says more than anything I could ever say. Who's responsible for gun crimes? If you look at the big blue slice, it says the perpetrator was carrying a firearm owned by someone else. What does that tell you? They're mostly stolen. If you have a break-in in your home, the guy that does the break-in is looking for two things: money and guns. And he will take those first before he will take anything else. So one of the arguments against gun control, and it's a good argument, is if you put on regulations, only the good guys will obey them. The bad guys are out there stealing the guns. They're not going to obey the regulations. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. We have 4% of the world's population. We have half of the world's guns. We have as many guns in the US as the rest of the world combined. This is a comparison internationally of gun-related killings. The US, 64%. This is as a percent of total homicide. 64% are by guns in the US. Canada is second with a little over 30%. England and Wales, 4.5%. Australia, 13%. We'll talk about Australia in a minute here. What's the price of a gun in the US? An assault rifle, like the one that was used in Las Vegas, is about $1,500. It's equivalent to a MacBook computer. Handguns, very easily accessible in stores, are about $200. Types of guns used in murders. Handguns are by far the biggest. The gray slice is other, and that would be assault weapons. The green slice that you see are rifles. Australia had a mass shooting back in about 1995. They had 35 killed and they had 28 wounded. They got very serious about gun control. They do not have any prohibition in their constitution involving guns, but they passed a law in 1996 that banned certain semi-automatic guns, and they instituted licensing and registration requirements. They said that a person must have a firearm license to possess or use a firearm. License holders must not be a prohibited person. It could be somebody who was a felon or had mental issues. All firearms must be registered by serial number to the owner. Owners of outlawed guns must participate in a mandatory government buyback program. And they actually instituted that program. They bought back 700,000 guns. Unfortunately, it was only about 20% of those outstanding. Now, they passed a later law that regulated the length of the barrel and the capacity of sport shooting handguns. They showed that 85 to 90% of Australians approved of that program. So what did it do? The red bars showed the homicides prior to the gun law. The blue bars are the homicides after the gun law. It made a real difference in Australia. Ghost guns. Everybody know what ghost guns are? It is hard to imagine how you could regulate something like this, but you would hope they would get a handle. Ghost guns are guns that you can buy on the internet in pieces. Anybody can do it. It's done fairly widely. You can assemble them in your basement or garage. They're fully functional. When they're done, they look exactly like their counterparts that are legitimate guns. They have no serial numbers whatsoever. They're impossible to trace. How readily available are they? I put in this news clipping that I found last year. On December 3rd of 2021, I think this was in Georgia, a 13-year-old boy was arrested for shooting and killing his 14-year-old sister. It turns out he had a business. He's 13. He was buying ghost guns online, assembling them and selling them. 13 years old. The public is divided. I don't have to tell you that there's anything new about division between Democrats and Republicans, but they're divided on gun control. This is a quick breakdown. The Republicans are the green bar, the Democrats are the blue bar. Allowing teachers and officials to carry guns in school, Republicans favor that. Allowing concealed carry in more places, the Republicans favor that. Barring gun purchases by people or on no-fly or watch lists for the airlines, it's about equal. Both parties seem to favor that. And preventing the mentally ill from purchasing guns, that seems to be one that both parties favor. This is a breakdown of states with assault weapons and restrictions. Assault weapons, as I said, are used to kill people. There's not much use in hunting, although you can define, probably as Tom Pletcher pointed out, you can define some hunting rifles as assault weapons, but generally not. States that regulate but do not ban assault weapons, Minnesota and Virginia. States with assault weapon bans, California, Connecticut, Washington, D.C., Hawaii, Maryland, Massachusetts, and New Jersey. One of the arguments that I always get into from people that are very pro-right guns are the fact that you can't restrict my right to carry a gun. Well, I have news for everyone. There is not a single right in the Constitution that does not have restrictions. If you can think of one, please come up afterward and tell me. Do you have the right to your life? No. If you do certain things, the government will take your life, and we do it. Do you have the right to freedom of the press, unrestricted? No. You can't slander me. The other things you can't do, there's not an unrestricted right to freedom of speech. Freedom of the press, the same way. Freedom of assembly. Can I go protest in the middle of the Dan Ryan Highway? I don't think so. So there's restrictions on every single right. There have been restrictions on your right to carry a gun for many years. You can't carry a bazooka into this room. We have restrictions now. We had a ban on assault rifles that was taken off under the administration of George W. Bush. There's some talk about maybe putting it back on, but the question is not, can you have restrictions on my right to carry a gun? The question is, where do I draw the line? One of the things that was recently talked about, are we running out of time?
Get close.
Okay, I'll go through this real quick. Red flag laws, not very widely recognized, not very widely used. They've only been used twice in Elkhart County as far as I can tell. I'm not sure that they would be a real good solution. Other possible solutions require gun registration, outlaw assault weapons, require a 30-day waiting period, ban high-capacity gun magazines, repeal congressional product liability immunity for gun manufacturers. Gun manufacturers were able to get through Congress some years ago an immunity under product liability laws, so they can't be sued. That was changed recently when the parents of the shooting in Massachusetts were able to get a suit processed on the basis of representation by gun manufacturers through advertising to susceptible young people, and they were found liable. That's it, guys.
Clarify, I've been a pheasant hunter all my life, lived in the country.
I don't know if you want to take time for any questions or not, but I'm happy to answer if you want to ask.
Questions?
The Second Amendment states a well-regulated pollution. For the years, how have been circumvented?
How has it been what?
Circumvented.
I'm not sure I understand the question, but the Second Amendment wasn't applied to individuals until we had the Heller case. So people just assumed that you could have a individual right to carry a gun, but it was never clearly defined. So in the Heller case, they made it clear that it does give you an individual right. I think that's how they got around it by basically ignoring it until it became an issue for them. Anybody else? Well,
is there any legislation pending or interest in, here in Elkhart, for instance, we have gun shows. And my understanding is the ability to purchase a gun through a gun show is very different than if you go to a licensed gun user. And it seems to me that that creates problems in other states.
Yeah,
the crowd that was there was interesting to me, not to mention the vendors.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Mo. The Congress finally got together after the Uvalde massacre, and they passed what's called the Safer Communities Act. It was the first gun legislation they've had in 20 years. I have to honestly say it was more political than effectual. It tried to close a couple of loopholes. One was called the dating partner. Right now, if you beat up on your spouse, they could get a court order that would prevent you from owning a gun. But it had to be a spouse. It omitted somebody, for example, it was a live-in partner, a dating partner. They closed that loophole. There was another loophole that we had for many years, the gun show loophole. If you go to a gun show, you could buy a gun, no background check, whatever you want to do, any